Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to Anastasia Radina, the head of the Ukrainian Parliament's Anti-Corruption Committee, about her country's efforts to root out corruption and her view on the future of the Russia-Ukraine war. Then we dive into the latest diplomatic developments in the Gaza Strip, including whether Hamas could be executing a carefully laid plan to retain political power even after its war with Israel ends. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. We've got a great discussion later in the show about the Ukrainian government's anti-corruption fight and the country's prospects in its war with Russia at what looks to be a pretty crucial moment right now in the future of that conflict. But Guy, before we get to all of that, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here once again. Actually, Ukraine is on my radar. One thing that isn't getting a great deal of attention but deserves more: Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's attempts to drum up support for a major Ukraine peace summit that Switzerland is slated to host on June 15 and 16. Interestingly, this is not a peace negotiation or a ceasefire negotiation because Russia hasn't been invited. Essentially, the summit aims to re-amplify Zelensky's ongoing push to draw in international support for Ukraine's plight against the ongoing Russian military invasion and really support for Zelensky's own peace proposals, which anchor around a demand for the full withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. So even if Russia was invited, the indication is that they wouldn't go. But it is also interesting how Zelensky traveled last week to Asia as part of the effort to get the broadest possible slate of foreign leaders to attend the Switzerland summit. He was at the Shangri-La Security Dialogue in Singapore, where he gave a press conference accusing China of supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine and of working to actively undermine the peace summit in Switzerland, suggesting that China may be bullying global South nations and smaller nations in Asia not to participate. Zelensky then visited the Philippines this week, and he met with President Marcos, who vowed support for Ukraine and said he would go to the Switzerland summit. The Biden administration is sending Kamala Harris, and there will be a wide range of European leaders there, including French President Macron. China, meanwhile, shot back at Zelensky, denying allegations that he made on his trip to Asia. Remember, of course, that China put forward its own peace plan for Ukraine more than a year ago, but it was very vague. It did not actually call for ending the war. It was more a list of Chinese statements denying Beijing's support for Russia. China has rhetorically claimed to be neutral on the war in Ukraine, but its trade with Russia has grown during the war. And U.S. intelligence sources argue that China is supplying parts for Russia's ramp up of weapons and other military equipment used in the war. There's a good deal of behind-the-scenes talk in Washington these days, Ben, that Chinese microchips are being used in Iranian-made drones that Russia is using in Ukraine, as well as certain Russian missiles. Although there hasn't been explicit proof of that made public at this point, I've heard different claims about it from different sources. I've also been told that the Ukrainian forces are scrambling to recover any unexploded missiles fired by Russia to dissect them in search of Chinese components. We'll get into the allegations of Chinese support for the war and what the war means for China geopolitically in our upcoming interview with Ukrainian Member of Parliament Anastasia Radina. Ben, that's a very interesting discussion we've got coming.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of Chinese components in some of these, Russian missiles and other, tools of war, that's something that when you talk to folks behind the scenes, as you well know, Guy, that seems to be something that's on everybody's radar, so to speak, that we're all kind of waiting to see if there's going to be any definitive proof of that at this point.
I think part of the problem is that there are Chinese made components that the Russians could go out and buy at a department store in any city across Asia and pack them into boxes and move them to Russia and then use them for manufacturing of certain missiles and in drone components and whatnot. But when it comes down to claims about ballistic missiles or hypersonic missiles, I think there's a lot of intelligence gathering going on about that right now.
Absolutely. Well, geopolitics, are front and center here all over the world. And I want to talk about Israel and Hamas, and specifically the ceasefire negotiations going on and other negotiations going on involving Hamas. But first things first, on this front, U.S. officials are back in the region this week. CIA Director William Burns traveled to Qatar, while White House Middle East Coordinator Brett McGurk was in Egypt. And both of these visits seem to be part of the broader Biden administration push to secure a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. President Biden laid out the terms of that proposal last week, which includes, a 6-week phase that would lead to a ceasefire across Gaza. Israel would withdraw troops from population centers. They would exchange hostages, including U.S. citizens, and additional phases that ultimately lead to a permanent end of the fighting and the reconstruction of Gaza. Now, whether that deal becomes reality looks pretty unlikely to me at this point, Guy, although maybe these trips by Burns and McGurk suggest otherwise. So I guess we'll see on that front.
I think the development that I saw, Ben, that could affect all of this was the Israeli strike inside Syria in recent days that killed another Iranian general who was in Syria. Remember that the last time this happened, more than a month ago, it led to a massive escalation of then direct attacks, an unprecedented attack by Iran directly on Israel, and then an Israeli counterstrike. So it seems like every time we get really close to a ceasefire, the Israelis push the envelope by carrying out a strike inside Syria. At least that's been the trend, or this could be a trend. So I'm watching that closely, what the blowback of that is, and we still don't know.
And simultaneously, there's another diplomatic front here that I think is probably even more interesting to me, and that's these apparent reconciliation talks between Hamas and the Fatah party. Of course, governs the West Bank. Another round of these talks is happening later this month in China, according to reports. This is interesting because the question we've all been asking, and a key part of Biden's peace proposal, is this idea of the day after in Gaza. What does reconstruction, future governance of the Gaza Strip, what does that look like when the war is over? Well, here's one potential answer, and I guess it might be the only answer, and that is that even if Hamas can't formally be a ruling party in Gaza, because Israel, and I would assume the U.S., wouldn't allow it, could it essentially help pull the strings behind the scenes? Reuters has a story this week quoting a bunch of unnamed Palestinian officials at the center of these talks. And the story said that Hamas has a goal of, quote, shaping the post-war order in the Palestinian territories. Now, it does quote one Hamas official by name, Bassem Naim, who says, quote, we are speaking about political partnership and political unity to restructure the Palestinian entity. Whether Hamas is in the government or outside it, that is not a prime demand of the movement, and it doesn't see it as a condition for any reconciliation, unquote. Now, it's worth remembering here that Fatah, the party founded by Yasser Arafat, went to war with Hamas in 2006 and 2007 over control of Gaza after Hamas won elections there. So almost 20 years later, here we are again, but the dynamics are very different, because it looks to me like Hamas is in the midst of executing a plan to retain political control in Gaza, at least behind the scenes, through some sort of power sharing dynamic with Fatah. I don't even know what other viable options could be on the table for this so-called day after the Israeli military operation is over. But that, to me, is a fascinating political dynamic that's going to unfold here over the next several weeks.
We are very lucky now to be joined by Anastasia Radina. She's a member of Ukraine's parliament and the chairwoman of the Anti-Corruption Committee in the parliament. Thanks, Ms. Radina, for joining us. First, we want to commend you as an anti-corruption warrior in Ukraine. Let's start with trying to understand what the corruption situation looks like within the context of the ongoing war against Russian invaders. Last year, you made international headlines in a standoff with then Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov over corruption involving procurement of materials for the Ukrainian army. There was a public standoff. Reznikov ultimately resigned, but only after he tried to get you to resign. What type of corruption was he specifically involved in?
First of all, thank you for having me. This is my ultimate pleasure. As to the situation with Mr. Reznikov, apparently he's no longer minister. I'm still chairing anti-corruption committee in the parliament, and after he resigns, after we in the parliament accepted his resignation, we actually managed to change procedures in non-lethal military procurement. We are working on changes procedures in lethal military procurement, and already now our procurement procedures have become 30% more efficient, which is a lot of money that went to better covering the needs of Ukrainian army. Now, as to the situation specifically with Mr. Reznikov, yes, I've been one of the vocal advocates of the fact that we should be resigning. I've been talking about this publicly after having a long attempt of in public conversation. At the same time, I have never implied that he actually was personally corrupt, that his hands were in any way dirty. My concern has always been that as a manager, he was not doing enough in order to change procedures.
What specifically was he alleged to be involved in? Was it marking up of prices or reselling of goods that had come in as aid?
There was a journalistic investigation, and according to journalists, there were allegedly inflated prices in the procurement of a few items for the military, food, military gear, some other things, non-lethal military procurement. When we studied the issue, we understand part of the problem has been lack of transparency in this procurement, and it only took us months in the Parliament of Ukraine to actually solve this issue and introduce almost pre-war level of transparency into this military procurement. And the result has been, as I said, 30% more efficient military procurement so far. And I'm seeing that the amount of money that were saved as a result of changing procedures, it continues to grow, which is a good dynamics.
Miss Radina, we should point out that you're a member of Ukraine's Servant of the People Party, part of President Volodymyr Zelensky's ruling governing bloc. What can you say to U.S. lawmakers over here in Washington who raise concerns about corruption? Obviously, in Ukraine, the corruption issue is watched closely. Late last year, there was actually a confidential Biden administration strategy document that exposed, it leaked to the press in the U.S., and it exposed concern in the Biden administration about corruption. What do you say to U.S. lawmakers who are concerned about that?
Well, first and foremost, I'm not here to say that we don't have any issues. Many countries do have their issues, so we do have ours. At the same time, we actually have opinions from reputable organizations as to the state of fighting against corruption in Ukraine. And I'd like to point out to two of those. First, Transparency International, with their corruption perception index, actually marked a 3 points improvement in Ukraine's standing in corruption perception index in 2023. And in last 10 years, our increase has been 10 points, which is a lot for the specific rating. And the trend has always been ascending, meaning moving from poor effort in fighting against corruption to improving the situation. That's first. Second, the European Union in the end of last year, in November 2023, also made a decision that Ukraine has implemented up to 90% of reform-related conditionalities, which allowed for taking the decision to formally open membership negotiations with Ukraine. So that's important. That's the trend. At the same time, we've been actually working for 10 years this year, since 2014, with our international partners, including with the US partners, US government, Department of State, USAID, to actually build an anti-corruption system in Ukraine. We had to start in 2014 from scratch. And by now, we have a full circle of independent institutions that started to deliver. I will probably give you one number that is very important for me. 20 times more corrupt judges were sent behind bars by decisions of high anti-corruption courts alone than by decisions of all other courts in all years of Ukrainian independence. So in 4 years, just one court sent 20 times more judges to prison for corruption than all other courts of Ukraine in all of the years. And this number is important because it shows that the era of impunity is over.
Mr. Radina, thanks so much for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you here. I want to shift and talk about the war in Ukraine now. And I'm curious your view, because the narrative here in the West, in the U.S. in particular, is that the tide has turned in Russia's favor over the past 6+ months or so. I'm curious, is that how you view it as well, that Russia at this point is, quote unquote, winning the war? And if so, is there more that you'd like to see from the West, from the US, from NATO to help put the momentum back on your side?
Basically, what you call a shift of tide, it actually coincided with a lack of supplies of munitions from Western partners, with lack of support from Western partners. And let me say this, my brother is on the front lines right now, and he's with the artilleries. There were days when there wasn't actually an opportunity for him to do his job because he haven't had munition. You can't expect military men to provide a result when they don't have munition, and the shortage of supply has been considerable in this specific period of time that you are referring to. So yes, in order to turn the tide, we first and foremost need to be sure of continuous supply of munition, at least at the level agreed between military commanders and Wiesbaden.
There's a lot of talk as well, sort of about what the end game is, and obviously Ukraine's position has always been that it wants all of its sovereign territory back, as obviously it rightfully should. But at this point, is there any chance of a ceasefire negotiation between Russia and Ukraine? I know there were some stories recently that the Kremlin was open to that, freezing the conflict along the current lines, which I assume would be unacceptable to Ukraine. But nevertheless, is the negotiating table where you think this war is inevitably going to end?
Well, first and foremost, let me speak from a personal perspective. I'm a mother of a 4-year-old son. It is my commitment as an individual, as a politician, as a mother, to make sure that my son does not inherit the necessity to fight in a war. What does this mean? That we cannot allow ourselves to negotiate on Russia's terms, because these are not negotiations. This would not lead to peace. This would lead to Russia just consolidating efforts and attacking again in some number of years, 5, 10, we don't know how many, but this is what Russia has always done. Whenever there was a ceasefire in Russia's military effort, they continued with wanting more. They started in 2014 in Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk region, did not receive proper reaction from the West, and this is true. The West continued just business with Russia as usual, which allowed Russia to accumulate more money and hit Ukraine even harder and harder. It is high time we actually learn from history and make peace on first Ukraine's term, on fair term, and I think there is actually no alternative.
Ms. Radina, I want to point out to our listeners that we are interviewing you via Zoom, where Ben and I are in our home offices near Washington, D.C. You're in your office in Parliament in Kiev because you currently don't have electricity at your home. What else can you tell us about personally about how the war has affected political processes in Kiev. Is the political resolve to continue fighting the Russians until their military forces are driven out of Ukraine? Is that political resolve as strong today as it was 2 years ago?
This political resolve is strong. And as to parliamentary job, now my parliamentary job is to make sure we move forward with anti-corruption reform and with rule of law reforms. I think we have been pretty successful with that. In just the past 6 months, we adopted 6 pieces of important legislation pertaining to anti-corruption reform, starting with the big thing of reintroducing asset disclosure and asset verification for all public officials. Moreover, we actually opened to the public information about the assets of public officials. We were even warned by some international partners that there might be security concerns, but we decided to make the step in order to do as much as possible to persuade the public in openness of the political circle and in our readiness to be scrutinized, verified, and in such a way to cut any thoughts of possible corruption among public officials. Reintroducing financial monitoring for politically exposed people, strengthening anti-corruption institutions, strengthening procurement framework. This is what we've been working for in the parliament.
Are you worried that Western Europe and the United States will lose the political will to back Ukraine or have already lost it? And are you also concerned with regard to political will about China's backing of Russia and the extent to which China may economically bully other countries in the so-called global South to abandon support for Ukraine?
Thank you so much for this question. I actually think it is not in the interest of the West. It is not in the interest of the United States specifically to stop supporting Ukraine. Why? Because we are not talking about just Russia's war against Ukraine in a pure situation. We're talking about axis of evil, which includes Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. We're seeing supplies from these countries attacking Ukraine. And if Russia does not receive proper reaction to what it's doing in Ukraine, so what kind of message would that send to China? What kind of message would they send to Iran? What kind of message would this send to peaceful citizens of Taiwan, for example?
I want to ask about President Zelensky quickly. He, of course, has stayed on despite his presidential term having technically ended because, let's face it, he's a wartime president and the security conditions don't allow, I guess, for an election to be held. Are you comfortable with that situation? How long would you be comfortable with, with having no elections held in Ukraine? What's your view of Zelensky and how the presidential elections, how that should be handled in the months to come?
Well, I actually don't think that it is technically correct to say that the term in office of Mr. President has ended, because the Constitution of Ukraine clearly provides that the president serves until new president comes into office. And that it is a very clear provision of Ukrainian constitution. It has been Russia's narrative and Russia's misinformation effort to disseminate a message that the president of Ukraine is not legitimate any longer. Here in Ukraine, no political fraction in the parliament specifically is questioning the legitimacy of Mr. President. No one is questioning that.
We're not questioning the legitimacy, but how long would you be comfortable without having elections?
How do you have elections when you don't have electricity? How do you have elections when 1 million of people are fighting on the front lines? Would you want people on the front lines to say, look, guys, just leave your arms here and go to the voting station? Are we comfortable with that? Or are we comfortable with them not having a voting right? That's just not fair. We cannot even talk about elections when 1 million of people who are paying the direst price for the liberty of Ukraine is not allowed to vote. That's just not fair.
Anastasia Radina, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your views for this discussion. I want to point out to our listeners that Ms. Radina wrote a very in-depth article about her anti-corruption work that was published in the National Interest in English a couple of months ago. We highlighted that in threat status as well. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week. This is our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat that is impacting U.S. national security right now. So, Guy, what do you have for us for your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that the U.S. defense industrial base has fallen dramatically behind China in terms of its capacity to produce major conventional military equipment. At a moment when much of the national security discussion in the U.S. is about high-tech developments, things like the convergence between AI and futuristic weaponry and drones, the reality is that China has surpassed the United States in things like shipbuilding. China's largest shipyard is bigger than all U.S. shipyards combined, and the general capacity of the Chinese maritime defense industrial base to build ships is something like 230 times the size that of the United States. That's actually a primary point that Seth Jones, who heads the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, makes in the latest Threat Status Influencers exclusive video interview. So my threat echoes what Seth Jones told me in that interview, Ben, that the Chinese defense industrial base is on a wartime footing, while the U.S. is still operating in a peacetime capacity and has only really just started to make efforts to reduce reliance on Chinese-sourced materials for conventional military equipment production.
My threat of the week is also going to involve China, but it's large-scale cyber fraud. Now, look, we all know, obviously, that cyber fraud is a huge problem. I think most folks have probably either, had their identity compromised in some way or had credit card information stolen or been approached by a phishing scam or the old, Nigerian prince email. We can go on and on. But the reason this is my threat of the week now is because of the scale at which these crimes are now taking place and what looks like to be the tacit approval or perhaps even outright support by some nation states. Now, just a few days ago, there was a Chinese national arrested in Singapore, and the FBI said he ran a major botnet for a decade. And authorities said this botnet compromised victims' computers and disguised their digital track so that the cyber crimes appeared to trace back to the victims' computers instead of their own. And then access to these victims' computers was sold to other online criminals who then in turn used it for identity theft, child exploitation, even financial fraud, including defrauding COVID-19 pandemic relief funds. This scheme amassed about $100 million in profits, according to the FBI. And FBI Director Christopher Wray said this botnet called the 911 S5 botnet, which operated in nearly 200 countries, was probably the largest ever in history. And it also seems to be the longest running because it was operating since 2014. The State Department shortly thereafter then sanctioned 3 more Chinese nationals for their involvement in the scheme, which in all compromised 19 million IP addresses worldwide over a decade. And here's another example quickly from The Guardian just a few weeks ago, which reported that more than 800,000 people in Europe and the US appear to have been duped into sharing credit card details and other personal data with a vast network of fake online designer shops apparently operated from China. Of course, this is called the largest scam of its kind, with 76,000 fake websites in almost a dozen languages offering goods from fake shops, brands like Nike, Hugo Boss, Versace, Prada. So we could dedicate multiple episodes to hacking and cyber crimes and cyber fraud. But what's noteworthy here is that rapid advances in technology, and now especially the proliferation of artificial intelligence, are going to make it easier for these scams to operate on large scales, affecting millions of people at a time and potentially involving billions of dollars. And if you have a government that might be willing to look the other way, that makes it infinitely worse. And that's why it's my threat of the week.
Definitely an interesting phenomena, Ben, that kind of is between the headlines. And it's certainly something that's worrisome that affects actually individual people, common people.
Absolutely. And something we're going to keep a close eye on, of course, here in the Threat Status Podcast. So thank you all for listening. Thank you, Guy, for joining us. And please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will be back next week here on the Threat Status Podcast.